The elite boardroom of Sterling Global was a tomb of glass and cold ambition, where the air hummed with the electric tension of a dying empire. Silas Sterling sat at the head of the mahogany table, his trembling hands clutching a glass of scotch as he awaited the arrival of the mysterious shadow investor who had just executed a brutal, hostile takeover of his life's work. The heavy oak doors swung open, but it wasn't a shark in a $3,000 suit who stepped into the room. Instead, Arthur Vane walked in, his heavy work boots striking the polished marble with a rhythmic, unyielding thud that echoed like a heartbeat. He was still wearing the same navy blue work shirt, stained with oil and red dust, that Silas had mocked exactly 1 week earlier. Silas stared, his jaw dropping in a paralyzed state of disbelief, as Arthur pulled a rusted keyring from his pocket and tossed it onto the glass table. The metal clattered loudly, the keys to the truck Silas had called trash, now sitting on the deed to his company. Silas thought he met his savior, but he didn't know he was meeting the man he belittled. The Monday sun was a harsh, white disk hanging over Vane's precision machining, where the smell of sun-baked earth and spent coolant filled the stagnant air. Arthur Vane was kneeling in the red dirt, inspecting the leaf springs of his 1992 Ford truck, when the silence was shattered by the high-pitched, metallic scream of a struggling European V12. A moment later, a lime-green sports car lurched into the lot, a plume of acrid white smoke erupting from its vents. Silas Sterling stepped out of the low cockpit, his designer sunglasses reflecting the rust and wear of Arthur's world, with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He didn't ask for help, he demanded it, his voice cutting through the quiet like a jagged blade. Silas pointed a manicured finger at Arthur's Ford, laughing as he called it a monument to mediocrity and rolling tetanus that belonged in a shredder. He paced the lot in his $1,000 loafers, telling Arthur that men who choose to drive rust deserve to spend their lives breathing in the dust of those who actually succeed. Silas sneered at the peeling paint and the mismatched tailgate, completely blind to the reality beneath the surface. He saw a rusted fender and a relic of a dying age, but he didn't see the custom-engineered turbine sitting under that hood, a mechanical masterpiece that could outrun his $1 million sports car in a heartbeat. Silas believed his wealth made him superior, unaware that he was standing in the presence of true greatness. Arthur pushed through the wooden screen door, the billionaire's hollow laughter still echoing in the red dust outside. He entered the cool, quiet space of the small house he had once built with Elena, where the air was always sweet with the scent of cedar and aged paper. Chloe was at the kitchen table, her small hands carefully disassembling an old alarm clock, her brow furrowed with the same analytical intensity her mother had once possessed. Elena had been a brilliant lead systems engineer at the massive Sterling plant, a woman who understood the intricate language of machines far better than the people who owned them, right up until the day a tragic safety failure in the main assembly line took her away. That day, Arthur had walked away from the high-stakes corporate industry, taking only his tools and his integrity to raise Chloe in the quiet of the valley. He knelt beside his daughter, his large, calloused thumb tracing the edge of the chronometer that sat in the center of the table. It was a hand-wound masterpiece, encased in simple brushed steel, designed and built by Elena during her final year. Silas Sterling would have seen it as an unremarkable piece of metal, but to Arthur, it was a living connection to the woman he had loved. He watched Chloe's eyes widen as he carefully explained that the expensive gold-plated watches Silas wore were designed only to be seen, but this chronometer was designed to be right. He told her that value isn't what is on the outside, but what lives deep inside the gears, where the truth is told. Chloe nodded, her fingers moving back to the clockwork with a focus that reminded him why he stayed. He knew that the billionaire's chrome world was built on a foundation of hollow arrogance, while his own life was anchored by a precision that couldn't be bought. As he wound the chronometer, the rhythmic ticking was the only sound in the room, a heartbeat that promised the time for a reckoning was now finally and truly and surely coming at last. Silas paced the edge of the dirt lot, his voice rising in an agitated pitch as he screamed at his assistant through an earpiece about the lack of available flatbeds in this primitive wasteland. Arthur ignored the noise, his attention captured by a wooden crate sitting on a nearby pallet that had been dropped off earlier that morning by a local courier. The manifest was stamped with the bold blue logo of Sterling Tech, containing a specialized batch of high-frequency processors for the upcoming V1 smartphone launch. Arthur reached out, his calloused fingers carefully lifting a single circuit board toward the harsh afternoon light. He didn't need a diagnostic suite to see the disaster. With an expert eye calibrated by 30 years of micromachining, he noticed a microscopic hairline fracture in the bismuth tin soldering joints of the primary thermal regulator. It was a systemic manufacturing flaw, a result of someone cutting costs by reducing the reflow oven temperature by just 2 degrees. To the engineers at Sterling Tech, the boards would pass every standard electrical test. But the moment they reached peak operating temperature in a user's hand, the joints would expand and snap. Arthur stood in the dust, holding the secret to a multi-billion-dollar catastrophe in his hand. He knew that in less than a week, Silas's flagship product line would brick entirely, leaving the firm in terminal collapse. A billionaire's empire was resting on a soldering joint thinner than a human hair, and Arthur was the only. The following morning arrived with the gray, heavy light of a coming storm. Arthur sat in the sterile, windowless office of the local bank manager, his work boots feeling too heavy on the thin blue carpet. He had spent months preparing the loan application for the workshop's new precision milling wing, a project that would have brought 10 high-paying jobs to the town. But the manager, a man named Henderson, whose eyes were constantly drifting to the framed photo of him shaking hands with Silas Sterling at a groundbreaking ceremony, pushed the folder back across the desk with a sigh of practiced indifference. Henderson told Arthur that in the new economy, there was no room for failing hobbyists who still worked with their hands, especially when a global giant like Sterling Tech was looking at the valley for a new logistics hub. He suggested that Arthur should quit the dream and sell the land before the taxes became a debt his daughter would have to pay. Arthur walked back to the truck, the cold wind biting at his neck. When he entered the kitchen, he saw Chloe at the table, her face falling as she looked at her art project, a beautiful, detailed model of a mechanical bird she was making for a regional competition. She was out of the high-end industrial clay she needed to finish the delicate wings, and Arthur knew with a sharp, jagged ache in his chest that he was exactly $40 short of the funds to buy it. The contrast was a silent, screaming weight. Silas Sterling had spent more on a single cigar that morning than Arthur needed to secure his daughter's entire dream. He looked at the rusted fender of his truck, feeling the world pressing in. The global headquarters of Sterling Tech was a cathedral of light and sound as Silas Sterling stepped onto the stage for the launch of the V1 smartphone. Surrounded by massive high-definition screens and the rhythmic pulse of electronic music, Silas looked like a man who had already conquered the future. He paced the platform in a sleek, charcoal gray suit, his voice booming with a predatory confidence that demanded absolute submission from his investors. During his keynote, he specifically mocked small-scale thinkers and relics of the past who still believed that human intuition could compete with the raw, optimized power of his global supply chain. He held up the V1 as a symbol of his own untouchable genius, a machine that he claimed was beyond failure and beyond the comprehension of ordinary men. Silas laughed at the idea of local competition, telling the crowd that the era of the craftsman was officially dead, replaced by the era of the empire. He believed his firm was a god among mortals, an entity too large to fail and too sophisticated to be challenged. He was so blinded by the glow of the spotlights and the roar of the applause that he didn't see the silent, urgent notifications beginning to flash on the monitors in the back of the room. He was entirely unaware that the faulty components Arthur had seen were already beginning to fail, and the first waves of catastrophic returns were starting to flood his system in Asia. Silas was dancing on the edge of a cliff. The garage was a pool of indigo light in the center of a sleeping town.
While Silas was drinking expensive champagne in a penthouse, Arthur was bent over a high-tolerance CNC machine. The sound wasn't the roar of a factory, it was a high-frequency whistle. Arthur watched the digital readout with a steady, unblinking gaze. The spindle speed was oscillating at 40,000 RPMs with a 0.0002 millimeter variance. This was the razor edge of physical reality. He was cutting a specific alloy, nickel cobalt, into a shape no mass production machine could ever handle. These were the microsinks. They were designed to act as thermal anchors for the very circuit boards Silas was currently bragging about. Arthur knew that when the V1 phone started to heat up in the hands of millions, the solder would melt. Only his microsinks could pull that heat away fast enough to prevent a total, irreversible system failure. He moved with a sensory intuition that no modern algorithm could replace. Each piece took 3 hours to mill. He wasn't building for a global market. He was building for a standard that only he truly understood.
Silas's experts relied on statistical averages and quarterly reports, but Arthur relied on absolute zero. He held one of the finished components under a magnifying lens. It was smaller than a grain of rice, yet it was the only thing capable of saving a multi-billion-dollar empire from a catastrophic meltdown. He worked through the night, the blue light reflecting in his weary eyes, knowing that the time for arrogance was ending and the time for a hard, cold reality was just beginning. Chloe was asleep in the house, dreaming of her art, but Arthur was awake, forging the leverage that would soon change their lives forever. He wasn't just a mechanic in a dusty shed. He was the master of a microscopic world that Silas Sterling had never even bothered to learn about. By dawn, he had 50 units, a 50-unit fortune that Silas would soon be begging for on his knees. The whistle of the spindle continued as the sun rose morning.
The town hall meeting was crowded and humid, the air thick with the smell of wet coats and the desperate, hungry energy of people who had been promised a corporate miracle. The town council, led by Mayor Davis in a suit that was a size too small, looked at Arthur from the high dais with a mixture of pity and impatience. They had been seduced by Silas Sterling's promise of a massive logistics warehouse, a project that required the exact 3 acres where Vane's precision machining had stood for 40 years. Davis didn't ask, he demanded, telling Arthur that he was being an obstacle to the town's prosperity and a relic of a past that no longer mattered. He suggested that Arthur should take the lowball offer, sell the land, and move his hobby somewhere else before the county was forced to exercise eminent domain. The crowd murmured in agreement, looking at Arthur as if his quiet integrity was a personal insult to their future. They called him selfish, a man who would rather keep a dusty garage than let his neighbors have jobs. Arthur stood at the back of the room, his calloused hands resting on the wooden railing, and said nothing. He was the quiet outcast who refused to bow to the new money, a man who understood that a town built on a billionaire's whim was a town built on sand. He walked out into the cold night air, the voices of his neighbors echoing behind him like a storm. The following morning, Arthur sat at his scarred wooden desk and did the one thing his conscience demanded. He drafted a formal, meticulously documented quality assurance report, outlining the specific metallurgical failure in the V1 processing boards. He attached high-resolution microscopic photographs of the fractured soldering joints and provided the exact thermal calculations, proving that every device would fail within 48 hours of heavy use. He sent the email directly to Silas Sterling's personal executive address, a channel usually reserved for billionaires and high-ranking politicians. 2 hours later, Arthur's phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a video call. Silas was sitting in the back of a luxury sedan, a glass of champagne in one hand and the report on a tablet in the other. He didn't look concerned. He looked amused.
Silas let out a cold, sharp laugh that echoed through the small garage, calling Arthur a delusional bottom feeder who was clearly trying to extort a settlement before the warehouse project pushed him into the dirt. Silas sneered at the technical data, telling Arthur that he had 300 PhDs in his engineering department who were worth more than Arthur's entire family tree. He barked that a man who spent his life working in a shed had no business telling a visionary how to run a global empire. With a flick of his finger, Silas commanded his assistant to delete the email and block the address, telling Arthur to stay in his lane and accept the reality that he was already a ghost. He ended the call with a final jagged insult about the rusted truck, leaving Arthur in the silence of the shop. Arthur didn't get angry. He simply closed the laptop and went back to his CNC machine. He had offered the billionaire a bridge, but Silas had chosen the fire instead. The warning was delivered, and the clock was now officially ticking toward a multi-billion-dollar disaster that no amount of corporate PR could ever hope to contain. The truth was now a silent ticking.
The trading floors in New York and London became battlegrounds of red ink as the market opened. Within 4 hours, Sterling Tech's stock had plunged 40%, a historic collapse that wiped out $10 billion in shareholder value before the lunch bell even rang. The reason was viral, visceral, and terrifying. The V1 flagship phones were not just bricking, they were undergoing catastrophic thermal runaway events. Videos were flooding the internet of sleek silver devices glowing orange before erupting into localized chemical fires on nightstands and in pockets. Silas was trapped in his glass-walled sanctuary, his hands trembling as he stared at a wall of monitors that were screaming in red. His head of engineering burst into the room, his face white with the sweat of a man who knew he was about to be executed. He told Silas that the internal temperature was spiking past the soldering threshold, exactly as the anonymous report had predicted. There was only one solution in the global patent database that could stabilize the thermal oscillation: the Vane heatsink technology. It was a masterpiece of microgeometry that utilized nickel-cobalt heatsinks to pull the thermal load away from the primary processor.
Silas was in a blind panic, barking orders to find this Vane, to offer them any amount of money, to buy the company outright if necessary. He didn't care about the cost. He only cared about the survival of his empire. He was frantically searching for a phantom savior in a luxury suit, completely unaware that Vane was the man in the grease-stained shirt he had laughed at in the red dust of a lonely country road. Silas believed he could buy his way out of the fire, but he didn't realize that the man who held the water was someone he had already tried to drown. The clock was ticking toward an absolute and total disaster that would leave Silas Sterling with nothing but a broken legacy and a mountain of lawsuits. He sat in the cold blue light of the office, his world burning down today. Arthur sat on the porch, the evening silence of the valley only broken by the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets. On his tablet, the news was a chaotic blur of red numbers and panicked anchors as Sterling Tech spiraled toward total liquidation. He had the leverage now. A single word from him, or a refusal to sell the patent for his microsinks, would be the final blow that shattered Silas's kingdom forever.
A part of him, a dark and wounded part, wanted to watch the arrogance burn until there was nothing left but ash and regret. But as he stared at the glowing screen, he didn't just see Silas's sneering face. He saw the 5,000 workers in the assembly plants and the design offices, people like Elena, who had given their lives to a machine they didn't own. He thought about their mortgages, their children's tuition, and the quiet weight of a home that would be lost if the firm collapsed under the weight of one man's ego. Chloe stepped out onto the porch, clutching her mechanical bird, her mother's eyes reflecting the soft moonlight. She leaned against his shoulder and asked if he could fix the broken company the way he fixed her toys. Arthur started to explain the complexity of corporate fraud and bankruptcy, but Chloe stopped him with a simple, devastatingly honest sentence. She told him that if he had the power to fix it, then he should, because that's what good men do. Arthur felt the heavy, cold knot of resentment in his chest finally begin to dissolve. He realized that saving the people required him to remove the man who had put them in danger. He wouldn't just fix the machine. He would take the keys. It was time for a new owner to lead. The world was focused on the chaos of the public markets, But Arthur Vane was focused on the microscopic movements of the numbers. He sat in his dark workshop, the blue light of 3 monitors illuminating his weathered face as he began a process that required more precision than any lathe he had ever operated. For 20 years, Arthur had been quietly accumulating royalties from a series of fundamental patents in micromanufacturing and metallurgical science, royalties that had grown into a mountain of capital hidden behind a series of impenetrable trust accounts. To the town, he was a struggling mechanic, but to the global financial system, he was an anonymous force with hundreds of millions of dollars at his disposal. As the news of the V1 disaster hit the trading floors in London and New York, the panic was absolute. Investors were dumping Sterling Tech stock at any price, the value of the firm evaporating at a rate of... Every time a panicked hedge fund sold, Arthur was there to catch the falling knife. He moved across the global exchanges, following the sun from Europe to America, his fingers flying across the keys with the same rhythmic certainty he used to mill a cylinder head. By noon, he held 10%. By 2 o'clock, he held 25%. He was systematically hollowing out Silas Sterling's empire from the inside, acquiring the very air the billionaire breathed for pennies on the dollar. He wasn't just buying a company. He was performing a surgical hostile takeover in the middle of a hurricane. Silas was likely in a boardroom screaming at his brokers, completely unaware that the man he had mocked as a bottom feeder was currently purchasing his legacy. Arthur watched the final block of shares settle into his account, confirming his majority position. The trap was finally closed, and the billionaire's world was now officially under new and absolute management. The morning would bring the reckoning. He was ready for the hard, cold truth now. The atmosphere in the Sterling Global boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive panic and cold, recycled air. Silas Sterling sat at the head of the mahogany table, his tailored suit jacket discarded on the floor and his hair disheveled as he looked at the stony faces of his board of directors. He was begging for a final emergency buyout, his voice high and jagged as he promised them that the firm could still be saved if they just injected another $50 million to stabilize the V1 line. He was still convinced that money was the only language the universe understood, oblivious to the fact that the physics of his failure were absolute. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Arthur Vane stepped into the room, his heavy work boots striking the polished marble with a rhythmic, unyielding thud that made the silver-haired board member stop mid-sentence. Silas stared, his jaw dropping in a paralyzed state of disbelief, as Arthur walked to the head of the table and placed a single, microscopic nickel-cobalt component in the center of the glass. Arthur's voice was low and carried the absolute authority of a physical fact as he addressed the room. He didn't talk about stock prices or quarterly earnings. He talked about heat. He explained the Vane heatsink, the patent Silas had mocked as a hobbyist's dream, and revealed the thermal calculations proving it was the only thing in the world capable of stopping the V1 phones from melting. As the directors looked at the microscopic masterpiece, Arthur leaned over the table and handed Silas a single sheet of paper. It was the confirmation of the majority stock acquisition by Vane Apex Holdings. The room went deathly silent as Silas read the document, his face turning a sickly ashen gray. He realized then that the grease monkey he had belittled as trash didn't just own the fix for his product, he owned the very building Silas was standing in and the air he was breathing. The billionaire's world disintegrated in a heartbeat as he looked from the rusted keys on the table back to the man who had finally brought the truth to his door. He wasn't just losing a company, he was losing a kingdom to a man who understood the gears. Silas was finally and truly silent in the dark and cold morning tonight. At this moment, he was gone. The silence in the boardroom was a crushing, physical weight that seemed to drain the air from Silas Sterling's lungs. Arthur Vane stood at the head of the mahogany table, his calloused hands resting on the edge of the glass with a quiet, unshakable authority that made every billionaire in the room look like a frightened child. He didn't wait for a formal introduction or a polite opening. Arthur exercised his majority voting rights with a single sharp sentence, informing the board that Silas Sterling was officially terminated from all executive and operational roles within the firm, effective immediately. Silas lunged forward, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unbridled rage as he screamed that Arthur couldn't do this, that he was a visionary, a king of industry who had built this empire from nothing. Arthur didn't flinch. He simply looked at Silas with a calm, pitying expression that was more devastating than any physical blow. He told the man that he had been so busy looking at the rust on a 30-year-old truck that he had completely forgotten to look at the name on the patents that made his technology possible.
Arthur noted that Silas had confused the shine of the chrome for the strength of the steel, and now the bill for that arrogance had finally come due. He gestured to the 2 security guards at the door, who had once been on Silas's payroll, but were now under Arthur's command. Silas was escorted out of the building he had built, his shoes scuffing the marble floor he had once walked on like a god, while the board members watched in a state of absolute wide-eyed shock. The billionaire who had arrived as a predator was leaving as a ghost, his name erased from the very halls he had polluted with his ego. Arthur didn't watch him go. He simply pulled out a chair and sat down at the head of the table. The justice was quiet, heavy, and absolute in the morning light. He was ready. Within 48 hours of the board meeting, the corporate world was rocked by a seismic shift that no analyst could have predicted. Arthur Vane was the new majority owner and CEO of Sterling Global. But he didn't move into the high-rise penthouse or spend a single dollar on a new designer wardrobe. He stayed in his work shirt, but the signature on the company's largest contracts was now his.
He immediately made a decision that shocked the board and revitalized his community. He authorized the relocation of the firm's global headquarters from the heart of the city to the small, dusty town where his garage had stood for 40 years. He transformed the abandoned textile mills into state-of-the-art precision manufacturing plants, creating 5,000 high-paying jobs for the very neighbors who had once looked at him as an obstacle to progress. He didn't just save the company. He used its massive resources to repair the soul of the valley. For Chloe, the reversal was a dream realized in vibrant color. Arthur purchased the historic art estate on the edge of the county, transforming it into the most advanced studio in the state, filled with every high-end clay and professional tool she could ever imagine. He didn't just give her wealth, he gave her the space to become the artist her mother always knew she would be. Arthur was no longer the quiet outcast struggling to buy a bag of clay. He was the most powerful figure in the region, a man whose integrity had turned a rusted truck into a $100 million legacy. He sat on his porch in the evening, watching the new lights of the factory across the hills, knowing that he had finally built a world that was worthy of Chloe's future and Elena's memory. The struggle was gone forever. The media frenzy surrounding Arthur's sudden rise to power was a whirlwind of flashes and frantic questions. But the most persistent curiosity was the rusted 1992 Ford truck still parked in the executive parking space at the new headquarters. A reporter from a major financial publication asked Arthur during a press conference why he hadn't replaced the relic with a vehicle that matched his new multi-billion-dollar status. Arthur looked at the woman, his calloused hands resting on the podium with a quiet, unshakable dignity. He told her that he kept the truck because it was a constant reminder of the truth that Silas Sterling and the world of corporate ego had forgotten. He explained that chrome can be polished until it reflects whatever lie you want to tell, but steel has to be forged in the fire of real struggle to have any value at all. He noted that the truck had carried him through the hardest years of his life and had never failed him once, unlike the high-priced machines that were designed only for show. To Arthur, the rust wasn't a sign of failure. It was a badge of endurance and a symbol of a life lived with integrity. He told the gathered crowd that a man who forgets where he came from is a man who is already lost, and that as long as he drove that truck, he would never forget the people who worked with their hands to build the world. He was a master of the machine and the debt. The afternoon was still and golden as Arthur and Chloe walked up the gentle slope of the cemetery hill, their shadows stretching long across the green grass. They stopped in front of Elena's headstone, a simple piece of granite that was surrounded by a sea of vibrant wildflowers Chloe had picked from the art studio gardens. Arthur stood in silence for a long moment, the cool wind brushing against his face as he looked out over the valley where the new factory buildings sat like anchors of hope in the red dust. He spoke in a low, resonant voice, telling Elena that the factory workers were finally safe and that the safety standards she had fought for were now the unyielding law of the firm she had died for. He felt a deep, grounding sense of peace, knowing that the world he had built for their daughter was finally worthy of the dreams they had once shared in their quiet garage. Chloe leaned against his shoulder, clutching her mother's chronometer, and noticed that the small, hand-wound masterpiece was still ticking, with a rhythm that was perfectly in time with the heartbeat of the afternoon. Arthur smiled, his eyes misting over, as he realized that some things never truly stop, they just change their form. The memory of Elena wasn't a shadow, it was a light that had guided him through the fire and into a future where integrity was the only currency that truly mattered. They stood together in the quiet, watching the sun begin to set over the valley they had saved. He was home.
Marlowe Street was no longer a forgotten stretch of cracked pavement. It was the heartbeat of a thriving community. The air was clean, the houses were painted, and the town hall clock actually worked again. At the end of the road stood the $100 million factory, a miracle of glass and steel that hummed with the quiet, efficient energy of people who knew their work mattered. Parked directly in the executive spot at the front entrance sat the rusted 1992 Ford truck, its mismatched tailgate a bold, defiant statement against the corporate chrome of the past. Inside the original workshop, which had been preserved as the soul of the company, a billionaire was hard at work. He wasn't sitting in a leather chair behind a desk. Arthur was on a rolling creeper under a vintage engine, his hands blackened with grease and his brow furrowed in concentration. Chloe walked in with a cold lemonade, and Arthur slid out from under the chassis with a full, unguarded smile that no stock market victory could ever produce. He had changed the world, but he had refused to let the world change him. Arthur Vane was the man who owned the empire, but he was first and always the dad who stayed in the garage to teach his daughter that a well-built life is the only machine that never breaks. In the quiet of the afternoon, the truth was finally and truly and forever loud. The red dust had finally settled on his shoulders.